a car into the tire barriers. That's Steve Park. This is at the exit of turn number 2.
I think that's where Richard Petty hit the wall here
Exactly.
2 years ago.
It sure is. Yep. It's a full course caution. First time this afternoon. Comes on lap number 25. Ooh, Park is way up on the tires and the barriers. John Kernan has a report.
They often say that the brightest star burns twice as fast. It is also said that luck is a cruel and unforgiving mistress. What started off as a surprise start that showed unbelievable promise had quickly devolved. For a man to help heal the wounds caused by the death of a 7-time legend, to see his career, along with the team around it, unravel the way it did seems almost cruel. Equally unfair is how quick one can call him a bust. He was potentially a perennial talent, instead being victim to a life-altering brain injury. This is the story of bad luck, a man robbed of ascension into championship glory and tribulations. This is the story of Steve Park. Steve Park was born on August 23, 1967, in East North Point, New York, on Long Island. Son of Bob Park, a well-known established modified driver in the Long Island area, it comes as no surprise that Steve took it up as his first foray into motorsports. Starting in 1986, despite only being 18 in his rookie season, it wouldn't shy him away from established short-track veterans such as Jeff Fuller, Mike Stefanik, Tom Baldwin, Ken Bouchard, and Jimmy Spencer. Besides, the goal was to get his footing in the sport, not outright win weekend to weekend. He'd have some great mentors to learn from with competition like that. He would also show immediate promise by finishing 13th in his first race at Riverhead Raceway, just behind Mike McLaughlin. He would improve this 2 weeks later at the same track, now finishing 11th, and 2 spots behind his father. 1988 would be his first full season, again with mostly education in mind. The School of Hard Knocks provided him with repair homework on rear-end housings, engine, cooling, and suspension systems. Despite this, he still managed a best-place finish of 4th at Jennerstown. 1989 would see him figure out the car troubles, and it paid off, rewarding him with 2 pole positions that season and 3 top 5s to boot. He dialed back his schedule to only 5 races for 1990, only to come back in 1991 strong with his first career win at Thompson. I guess he caught up on much-needed sleep. Starting from then on, seasons went from strength to strength, inching away closer to an overall victory. Between 1993 to 1996, he managed to win 15 races, 4 of which were flag-to-flag victories. Against drivers that were far from pushovers, even in that era, modified maniacs such as Reggie Ruggiero and Ted Christopher made sure to keep Steve Park honest. Despite these great efforts, he would finish no better than 2nd in points for both 1995 and 96, just being beat out by Tony Hirschman, who himself would go on to get a total of 4 career Tour-modified championships. Steve would prepare himself for a 1997 season, or so he had originally planned, to try and finally clinch a title. Instead, he'd get a surprise phone call during the off-season. A certain 7-time Cup Series champ had been eyeing him for a season title bout of his own, and with his own team effort. The man was none other than Dale Earnhardt, who saw immense potential and knew Steve would be a perfect fit. Steve, however, I guess initially figured he wasn't quite worthy for the ride, as he initially was convinced that the voicemails weren't from Dale at all. In fact, he believed it was more likely that his friends were playing a prank on him to kick him whilst he was already down. Reality set in when the mustache man from Kannapolis insisted on explaining why the hell Steve hadn't called him back. He finally took the offer seriously after some reassurance, and off he went to try out in the Busch Series. It wouldn't be his first ever foray, but his attempts in 1990 and 1995 weren't anything as far as blinding performance, to say the least. And, this time around, he'd actually be properly backed financially at least. He'd get to drive the number 31 Good Run Chevrolet for DEI, qualifying 13th at Charlotte's Fall Race. He'd hold his own until a crash on lap 117. Still, alongside his modified racing resume, this was proof enough that Steve can be put into a full-time seat. For 1997, he would now be sat in the now legendary number 3 AC Delco Chevrolet Monte Carlo, with Tony Eury as his crew chief. An important facet of Steve Park's modified racing days that I failed to mention earlier was that he was responsible for building up his own cars. Yes, they were bought chassis and engines, but someone had to put the pieces together, front to back. Oh, And he did this while he had a full-time job. Yep, that's right. And while some folks can barely manage one or the other, Steve almost managed a Tour Modified championship while juggling a million responsibilities. The skill set would come in handy, especially in his Busch days, where he would now put it together in now infamous red-headed stepchild AC Delco Chevrolet, working on it and cars like it, all day until midnight or 1 in the morning. There was one catch, though, and that wasn't so much with the cars themselves. It came from his boss. You see, he lived together with Earnhardt for a little while, and he had a tendency to wake him up at 4 or even 4:30 in the morning, kicking the side of his bed. What was the emergency? Well, Dale really wanted to show Steve some new deer, and Steve wasn't really big into the whole hunting thing either, but nonetheless, he would listen to his insights. Hell, he was going to be up for at least 3 or 4 more hours anyway before work, so you may as well listen. Big E was also the reason why the redheaded stepchild was called the, well, redheaded stepchild, and why it was painted the way it was. It was initially to help identify it at the Nashville Busch race it first appeared at. This successful combination would lay the groundwork for Dale Jr.'s Busch Series championship runs, and in turn, title successes. As for Steve, perhaps unsurprisingly, he would earn the 1997 Rookie of the Year title. With the Busch Series program having been ironed out, it was on to ironing out the bugs in the DEI Cup program. Despite the cars being similar between the series at a glance, it would be a massive leap for anyone to try and make the plunge and go up against the established teams and veterans of the Cup Series regulars. Not to mention that not all tracks were concurrent with the Cup Series schedule at the time, meaning that all new race program had to be adjusted to. Gone were the days of racing at Nazareth on Saturdays and banging fenders at Milwaukee. It was now time to take on the bigger speedways on a more frequent basis. As for the off-season, the now legendary and, frankly, beautiful #1 Pennzoil Chevy Monte Carlo would make its debut at Speed Weeks at Daytona in '98. It wouldn't be the most auspicious of starts, though, getting his sea legs under him to just start 33rd. By about lap 158, the engine would lose the fire and call it quits, sidelining him for the rest of the day. Not a good start to what would be in later years sheer DEI plate race dominance. He'd finished 41st. The following week would be Rockingham with a far better starting point being 19th. A good run through the day proved the pace of the #1 car until accidents would once again sideline a lot of drivers and pausing momentum for the team. Even Darrell Waltrip couldn't keep it out of the wall. An extra kick in the teeth for him given that the Speed Block sponsorship deal didn't pay out a single red cent. The following week at Vegas wouldn't go any better. In fact, he would fail to qualify along with 5 other drivers, forcing him to sit it out and watch it from the sidelines. But worse was yet to come. During next week's practice at Atlanta for the Prime Star 500, a tire failure would cause a violent accident. Send the #1 car into the outside wall, ricocheting directly into a pit road barrier. Fortunately, no crew member or anybody else was hurt, but the same could not be said for Steve. He'd survived the heavy hits, but not without being left with a broken collarbone and leg. It would immediately put into question the momentum of the program, now with DEI's headlining star out of the picture. More pressing was his need for rehabilitation. Darrell would step in a #1 car starting at Bristol. As with any athlete, it's not easy for them to be told that they can't participate, even if it's for their own good. Though he would finally recover enough to make the race in Indianapolis, he would once again wreck out by lap 148. For the rest of the season, he would stumble, but would try to make do despite being sore from his injuries. Doing his damnedest, though, he would fail to even make a single top 10 the entire season. The following year was not much to write home about either. Consistent he was, and he would finish races, but very rarely, if ever, inside the top 10. He'd suffer a very heavy crash at Sonoma that wouldn't help his injury situation either, in fact compounding the already complex situation, and becoming a prelude for what was to come. Even with the late Steve Mills' guidance from the pit box and the likes of Paul Andrews later that season, things continued to still be on a downward slope. The following year would bring about a new millennium and hopefully new momentum. This time there was no more room for excuses. Damaged goods he may have been, but it was really time to be the lead driver in the DEI program. He wasn't put in the flagship car on accident, and it was put up or shut up. And on August 13th, all the doubting Thomases, they shut up.
And Steve Park is gonna do it. Steve Park is going to win the Global Crossing at the Glen, his first NASCAR Winston Cup victory in his 77th race. Back at Watkins Glen, and Steve Park can't wait for victory lane. He just drove to the start-finish line, got out of the car moments ago, and received the congratulations from his hometown, or home state fans, I should say.
To silence the doubters is one thing, but to do it in front of your home crowd? Priceless. It finally seemed like the path to recovery was indeed coming along in good form, beating out the road ringers who had qualified ahead of him. Speaking of qualifying, he even managed to nab poles at Bristol and Homestead, showing that even with his head out of sorts, he can still put together a lap time that simply can't be beat. Whilst the naysayers continued to look for excuses, the shot over the bow that Steve had sent was clear. Don't count me out. Steve Park was back in business. However, unfortunately for Steve, DEI in the entire sport, fate once again reared its ugly head.
Seven-time Winston Cup champion and former Daytona 500 winner Dale Earnhardt has died from a crash suffered in Sunday's Daytona 500. The accident occurred on the final lap of Sunday's race. The tragic news came Sunday night, 2 hours after the race ended, from NASCAR President Mike Helton.
This is undoubtedly one of the toughest announcements that I've ever personally had to make. But after the accident in turn 4 at the end of the Daytona 500, we've lost Dale Earnhardt.
This changed everything, and not for the better. The loss of Earnhardt brought about the end to the ability for Mike Skinner and Dale to hash out their differences. The end of an incredible racing career that was supposed to end a year later under his own terms. A potential endurance racing legend in his own right. The loss of a leader in his own Cup Series program they had been working on for years, and worst of all, the loss of a father. There was time for mourning, but there was also a race schedule to look ahead to. Time waits for nobody, and everybody at DEI knew this. On February 26, 2001, the grid was set. Steve would just miss out on the pole position to Jeff Gordon, and will have to make do starting on the outside. Nobody said this would be easy, but it certainly didn't help matters. He would have some very big shoes to fill here, but there was no time to worry and wallow. The green flag was out, and they were underway. The initial start was as expected for tracks of this nature, the low groove being the place you wanted to start and lead at, naturally making it very easy for Jeff to pass Steve, who in turn would have to concede into the second spot. Just as it was becoming a clear-cut affair, however, flashbacks from just a week prior reared their ugly heads once again. This time it wasn't Dale Earnhardt, but it was Dale Jr. in the wall after a very hard hit. What made it particularly terrifying was the angle that he hit at. The in-car camera would show that it was no doubt a very hard hit, but he was nonetheless conscious and fortunately alive. The accident was initially started by Ron Hornaday, ironically himself a former driver and even champion of Dale Earnhardt's own Truck Series program, getting into the back of Jr., who was checking up into turn 3 for the cars ahead of him. Drivers like Jimmy Spencer, Kenny Wallace, and Sterling Marlin all simply had nowhere to go but to pile in. To onlookers, watching Jr. stumbling down the banking, while it did demonstrate the fortunate side of him surviving the incident, it would represent a continuation of the Daytona tragedy all the same. The plans for a clean, somber lap number 3 in memoriam of the great man would instead be marred by a yellow flag and safety trucks. What would this mean for the rest of the race? After 11 laps of caution, a terrible situation was now made worse by the arrival of rain. A very bitter kick in the teeth, especially for a now dejected Dale Jr., who could only look on as Tony Uri and co. attempt to salvage what was left of the number 8 Budweiser car. That is, assuming it is even safe enough to repair it in the first place. 25 laps later, the situation remains completely miserable. The sound of jet dryers replaced the sounds of an excited crowd. A few laps after that, teams opt for tires and fuel to save a stop for later. Finally, on lap 32, the mood once again changes. The eyes are now on the 15 car of Michael Waltrip, the 29 of Kevin Harvick, and of course, the number 1 of Steve Park, running behind the 24 of Jeff Gordon. The front runners are single file, but further back is very narrow side-by-side racing. Steve finally begins to gather himself up, and begins to challenge Gordon for the lead, and finally manages to eke by. proving the confidence he had in the car on the weekend all along. However, go figure, just as soon as he starts leading the race, the rain reappears. But on the upshot, it would give the one team a break and would allow them to restart in clean air. Rockingham being as abrasive as it is, teams would opt for fuel and tires once again. Steve Park wouldn't take any chassis adjustments, but will take full fuel, 4 Goodyear Eagles, and, to put the icing on the pit road cake, would even beat Jeff Gordon off of pit road, providing a buffer when they finally go green once again. Rick Mast will have to peer through a cloud of smoke from the number 50's engine bay, providing another cloud to the rainy day for both competitors and fans alike. In the interim, what remained of Junior's car would be sent home onto the hauler, and the race would be postponed till the following morning. The following race day, and the sun's rays would greet the drivers, and show Stacy Compton, who did not pit during previous day's yellow flag pit stops, allowing him to start first in the number 92 car. Some folks, such as the number 9 team, opt to make adjustments before the green flag. Paul Andrews, the crew chief for the number 1 car, meanwhile opts out, confident in what they do already have, and acknowledging that it would take more than just a few green flag runs to really say for sure if any improvements would actually, well, improve anything at all. In the meanwhile, Ward Burton complains of a missing stick of chewing gum on the dash of his number 22 Caterpillar Dodge. As this is an unapproved change to add another stick of juicy fruit, he'll just have to make do, for the moment, with the few he has left. To this day, the stick of gum was never found. With the green flag back in the air, on lap 56, Stacy did not, in fact, have it going on, and would have no choice but to let Jeff Gordon slip by, Steve Park not far behind him. With 321 laps remaining, the other DEI car, the number 15 Napa Chevy of Michael Waltrip, holds its own unusually on the high side of the racetrack. A backup car that hadn't seen any track time until happy hour that day, now has potential top 5 contention, given enough time and race pace. At the same time, on the low line, the number 1 car now occupies the space to pass the 24 car. Jeff opts to battle it out from the high line going forward. A few laps later, Stacy Compton heads to pit road. It turns out that staying out for additional TV time might not have been worth it, and proved to be a very high cost for positions out on track. But the other car with no signs of stopping is Steve Park, now pulling away and then some from Jeff behind him, attempting to put a buffer zone between him using lap traffic. The tables turn as lap traffic Steve Park used as a buffer was now being used as a buffer against him, bringing him and Jeff back closer contention once again. The speed differential becomes so much so that Matt Kenseth even managed to pass both of them to gain a lap back. Sure enough, Jeff would start to slip past Steve once again to regain the lead as a consequence. Over 20 laps later, Steve's car begins to fall off big. A void begins to build between the 24 and the 1 car, and the only cure will be fresh tires and fuel. With 268 laps left to go, finally the pit window opens wide, welcoming all competitors who wish to cycle out on something other than South Park Canadian Tire Specials. Amongst the takers were Robbie Gordon, Ricky Craven, Steve Park. 4 Goodyear Eagles, fuel, and right side chassis adjustments were in order. For the number 15 crew, meanwhile, unlike most of the field, opts for no chassis adjustments, just the scheduled full service, en route to a back-to-back victory. 260 laps left to go, and it's back to the Jeff and Steve show. And a show it was indeed, as the right front on Steve's car didn't exactly look pretty to say the least. Rockingham being the usual cheese grater self. Can he hold on until the next cycle? Well, we'll have to see. Despite doubts, though, 57 laps out of 142 were led by him, and by lap 162, the high side was no longer working for Steve, consequences of which resulted in him losing the lead to Jeff once again. With 225 laps to go, he'd lose second spot to defending Winston Cup champ Bobby Labonte, who himself ends up reeling in Jeff Gordon. By lap 181, he indeed passes him. 204 to go, Ricky Craven, who started 41st that day via a provisional, also found his way past Steve. It was around this time that the green flag stops would begin once again, providing a buffer for those who were oppressed by the Carolina cheese grater. Harvick, Hornaday, Bobby Hamilton amongst them. With 192 laps to go, Sterling Marlin too looks to even take 4th spot away. Steve was frankly falling apart in the car. With 187 laps to go, another green flag stop for Steve and others. At lap 232, the gap between Bobby and Jeff continues. With 151 to go, Michael Waltrip's luck too starts to run out as he is put a lap down. Moments later, Dale Earnhardt's former teammate in a number 31 car, Mike Skinner, too has his luck run out, causing him to get loose off the corner and almost taking out Jeff Burton in the proceedings. Luckily, a crinkled rear bumper damage is the worst of it, and we can take advantage of a now very busy pit lane. Jeff Gordon will beat them off pit road, but Steve will just manage to barely eke past Bobby Labonte to come out second. Lap cars, as per the rules, will be allowed to pit next after the leaders. Michael Waltrip obviously among them, opting for a wedge adjustment as well this time round. With 136 to go, Ricky Rudd appears to have terminal engine damage. The cars avoiding him no doubt do have terminally soiled their racing seats as a consequence. A pit road investigation, however, uncovers that the terminal transmission trouble instead. With 133 laps to go, the battle for first kicks off once again. In the meantime, plans are underway to look around pitting with 50 laps to go for a potential final service. At lap 106, discussions on the 24 about an overly tight race car mean time for adjustments during said final stops. Johnny Benson, the number 10 car, is also a man on the mission. Hasn't been seen for most of the race, but suddenly just found himself passing Bobby Labonte a bit earlier, and hangs strong in third. He has yet to finish top 10 at the track, but today he may even end up getting a top 5 at the very least. Moments later, caution will come out for sheer catastrophic engine failure for Stacey Compton. It's worth pointing out, just as a slight aside, this was the second major race for Dodge horsepower, at least as far as short tracks went. Leaders would once again pit, though a tad earlier than anticipated. The fuel can last to the end of the race from here, assuming it stays green. But can the drivers, and more importantly, can the tires make the distance? At lap 307, it was time to test that theory, and with them once again underway, Jeff rockets under and past Steve, who will have to hold firm for now. Mark Martin behind both of them, seeking and sneaking to try and race around them to get his lap back. The number 1 team counts on the long-run ability of the Pennzoil Chevy to make up the deficit. After all, they're planning on running 50 laps longer than they originally anticipated for tire longevity. With 71 laps to go, the number 77 of short track legend Robert Presley made a little too much liberal use of Jasper Engine's horsepower, forgetting he wasn't on a dirt track, and almost getting dangerously loose off the corner. By lap 339, Steve once again just ekes out ahead of Gordon. The final segment is now underway, the long-run car now coming into the fold. The time for just following the leader was over. It was time to be the leader. And by lap 359, that second-and-a-half lead is cut back down to less than a second due to lap traffic. Steve Park, however, continues to hold firm, but is not in the best of headspaces. Paul Andrews and Steve Reeves continue to reassure him to not charge forward and waste their tire management advantage. With 20 laps to go, the lap traffic situation works to Steve's advantage. Bobby Labonte now becoming the major threat to Gordon, so long as the lap cars continue to stay in the way. With 15 laps to go, the situation pervades so much that even with the 25 of Jerry Nadeau, Gordon's teammate at the time, making a hole for Gordon to get through, it's still not enough to disallow Bobby from making the much-needed pass on the bottom. If Gordon wasn't pissed off before, he sure was now. With 8 laps to go, Bobby now becomes the true, clear, and present danger. The lap traffic has mostly dissipated, with the car now becoming almost a mile an hour faster than Steve's. It will be a matter of if and not when they'll be in a dogfight for lead spot. By 5 laps to go, this has now shrunk to just a full second for Park over Labonte. 4 to go, 0.6 second advantage. And with 2 to go, Bobby demonstrates the ability for his car to stick better on the surface. But the tenacious Steve holds him off on the backstretch, and with 1 lap to go, history will be made. Need I remind you that Earnhardt hired him for a very good reason? Sure, he didn't have 2 modified championships, but so what if he came to be a runner-up in one of the most toughest divisions in all of American motorsports, overcoming adversity, injury, doubt, self-doubt, naysayers. He becomes a 2-time Cup Series winner, and best of all, succeed in a second straight win for the DEI program. With a Polish victory lap and a number 3 hat in hand, Steve was simply larger than life that day. He helped build the program, and now is helping to patch its wounds. A beautiful day, regardless of who you were. The The last of the fuel is expended from the victory lap, and the number 1 team and company will have to push the car to victory lane. A tearful victory, but with tears of joy. Whatever happened from now on, it was only going to be up there from the organization. Unfortunately, while this would ring true for the rest of the organization, especially Dale Jr., this would not ring true for Steve. No good deed goes unpunished. Keen on increasing his Busch Series commitments, he would make his return to Darlington that year, but this would prove to be yet another life-changing decision, and for the worse. The 25th race of the season, on September 1st, 2001, at the South Carolina 200, a horrific accident occurs under caution. Due to a badly offset steering wheel, Steve broke hard to the left. As this occurs, Larry Foyt drives right in the driver's side of the car. Not only would this reset any injury recovery from Steve by this point, it compounded issues beyond repair. For the rest of his life from this moment on, he would suffer with yet another serious brain injury, resulting in permanently slurred speech and permanently affected vision. To this day, he has not fully recovered. Despite taking off the entire off-season and the first 5 races of 2002, he was forever changed, not in a good way. Though doctors would clear him to compete, concerns went from simple naysaying to people being deeply, genuinely concerned about him continuing racing at all. It was clearly unsafe and dangerous. But you know how race car drivers can be, and hey, the doctors cleared him after all. Needless to say, the results were not good, being lucky to finish in the top 20, but averaging in the top 30. On July 28, 2002, not long after the start of the Pennsylvania 500, an already terrible season almost became his very last. Fortunately, he would live to tell the tale, and even more astonishingly, he would recover to run at the Brickyard the following weekend, where he would score his first top 10 of the season, nabbing 7th spot. Which, honestly, given the circumstances, may as well have been a victory all its own. His best finish this season would come at Talladega in October, grabbing 6th spot. He'd walk away, shaken but alive, in 33rd place in the point standings. 2003 would see yet another change in his career, but not the one he would have wanted. He would now be replaced in the very car and program he helped develop. The agreement would allow him to run the first 11 races of the season for DEI, but he wouldn't be on his way out come the Coke 600. Indeed, he would still falter for decent finishes, but it is worth mentioning that he would send off his time in DEI with a pole position at Fontana in April that year, but that would be it. From the 12th race on, Jeff Green would take the place of Steve Park in the number 1 Pennzoil car, and Steve would fill the seat of the admittedly very pretty and now iconic number 30 AOL Chevy for Richard Childress Racing. Despite the sharp-looking ride, everybody knew this was absolutely a downgrade. Think about it. Steve just went from being the progenitor of a racing dynasty, car builder, and main driver, to a support driver to another organization. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, and unfortunately, as much as I hate to admit to it, it is not without reason. To put it simply, and frankly but bluntly, his best days were long behind him. Granted, this was largely through no fault of his own, aside from the stepladder he may have walked under on the way of the Darlington Busch race, but it doesn't make it any less painful. Despite being the secondary ride that basically only exists to provide technical data for the mainstay RCR entry, that being the number 29 of Kevin Harvick, of course, he nonetheless made do. At that year's Pepsi 400 qualifying in July, he would put it on pole for the race. While he didn't end up winning the race, the honor said going to 2002 Busch Series champ Greg Biffle, you can still put that on the list of accomplishments in his Cup career. Another feather in his cap, if you will. However, despite this, and a top 5 that year, that would be it as far as his Cup career was concerned. Literally. It was decided that it was time to call it quits, at least as far as full-time commitments went, and move on down the Truck Series starting in 2004, where he would race full-time for Michael Gaughan in the number 62 Dodge Ram, with Johnny Allen as his crew chief, and with Charlie Wilson stepping out of the box later that season. Things would be, how do I word this, initially very average. Starting in the top 20 just about every weekend doesn't exactly scream the next Mike Skinner, to put it not so elegantly. Still, the trucks are notorious for being, well, very weird handling machines. The crossweight alone is quite different compared to even a Busch car, but especially a Cup Series machine. The injuries, plus the difference in performance, isn't exactly conducive to a smooth transition for anybody in such a state of affairs, let's be perfectly honest. Still, come the Dover race, he would lead his first 17 laps of the season, and at a marvelous Milwaukee Mile, he would score his first top 5 of the season. The following weekend at Kansas saw him lead only a mere 3 laps, but nonetheless resulted in another top 5, with additional top 5s at Nashville and Darlington, respectively. He would go on to finish the season 9th in points, a very respectable finish by itself, given that he had finished ahead of 10th place Chad Chaffin, who was racing for Bobby Hamilton's operation, arguably one of the most competitive truck series teams in history, and Mike Skinner, who only managed to finish 11th in points that year. Go Steve. The following year would see him dial back his truck series commitment to only 22 of the 25 races on the schedule, but he would stay in the number 62 once again. Speed Weeks started off a little bit better than last time, with a 18th place starting spot, but unfortunately the engine decided that it too had another place to be, and that being not Victory Lane, and would give up come lap 82. He would go on to finish 23rd that day. Now, this is speculation, but I guess somebody at the engine department either got fired or the one-off Jasper engine sponsorship for the following race at Fontana included a free comprehensive motor package as well. In either case, after leading only 5 laps, the now 37-year-old Steve Park would win his first and only Truck Series race of his career. Finally, another thing to cross off the list. With the rest of the season being, well, just a season to say the least, one could tell that Steve was already considering getting out of trucks too. Despite another top 5 at Charlotte, he would finish 22nd in points. 2006 would be only a 10-race schedule for the number 59 of James Harris, with even less to write home about this season, with the only highlight being a lone top 10 at Mansfield in Ohio. For the next 2 years, he would dip out of the top 3 series competition altogether, only making a grand total of 4 truck starts between 2009 to 2010. By age 42, and with a heavy heart, he would retire from mainstay competition altogether. Now you'll note my very careful wording there. I said mainstay competition. You can't keep a man like Steve out of a driver's seat for very long. He would be doing some one-off ARCA starts here and there just to keep himself going, but by the 2010s, Steve had a brainwave. See, his career was kicked off via modified racing. It's always something that he would have loved to keep doing had he not ended up having Cup ambitions. Hell, had he not ever got that DEI phone call in the first place, he would have probably still remained a modified regular to this very day, but like all things in NASCAR, time too is a circle. On September 11th, 2011, Steve Park would make his tour modified return at Thompson Speedway in Thompson, Connecticut. Of the 23 modified maniacs that day, he still held his own to finish 5th, beating out Frank Fleming. This must have finally flipped a switch, because by 2013, Steve Park was a true return to form, even for a one-off. 2013 would give him the chance to prove he still had it, at the now famous Battle at the Beach at Daytona's parking lot area, and it would be the perfect stage for him to perform at. It may have been a quote-unquote exhibition race, but to Steve, it was a lot more than that, and to likewise the fans as well. If you were a Mike Stefanik fan, you might not like this next clip, but I think it can exemplify a little bit more than I can put into words. Roll it. Despite it all, despite the injuries, despite the foibles, despite the doubts, he was still a winner. And with another feather in his cap, being a win at Daytona. And with that, he could finally end on a high note. At the age of 45, Steve Park would officially retire from racing and focus on retiring, alive and at peace. Some much-deserved solace. Today, Steve is retired in the Mooresville area, enjoying the Lakeview, and has started a battery, bulb, and electronics repair and recycling company. I'd also like to take a quick opportunity to mention that Glen Thurman has done an incredible job covering the history of the number 1 car, and its existence through other teams to this day. Check it out. I'll leave a link in the description after this so you guys can take a look at it, see what happened to the legacy of the 1 car. Tell him Clumsy sent you. Anyway, I don't want this to end on a lame, looking off into the distance in sadness kind of deal. I mean, Steve Park was a badass despite it all. So, how about a montage of his greatest moments? Does that sound good? Alright, let's do it.